Hello, young scholars. This is Mr. Martyron with your Flip Classroom on voting behavior. In this video, we're going to take a look at AP Government Standards 5.1 and 5.2. 5.1 deals with voting rights and models and behaviors. So we're going to look at factors associated with political ideology, efficacy, structural barriers, and demographics that influence the natural degree of political participation. We're also going to look at Standard 5.2, which is voter turnout. And this is factors associated with political ideology, efficacy, and demographic influence, the nature and the degree of political participation. Political scientists have long noticed the correlation between demographics and voting behavior. After election, exit polls and other surveys are conducted to draw conclusions about which people vote and how and why they vote as they did. You can make correlations based on age, education, personal income. They all appear to correlate between rates of voting. Older, better educated, wealthier voters tend to show up in higher numbers. Activists, people who attend church, people in the military, veterans, and members of civic organizations also tend to turn out in higher numbers. Some of these groups vote in noticeable patterns, and these patterns are known as voting blocks. One of the easiest ways that political scientists divide and analyze voters is along gender lines. And there's something called the gender gap, and this is the difference in political views between men and women. Political scientists will use this data to understand voting trends and voting behavior. For example, in 2016, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton won 53% of the women vote. 4 years later, in 2020, former Vice President Joe Biden carried women 59 percentage points to Donald Trump's 40%. Political scientists can even break data down even more specifically. For example, black women in 2020 overwhelmingly supported Vice President Joe Biden, 93% to 6%. And women that did not have college degrees overwhelmingly broke for President Trump, 60% to 39%. Women tend to oppose harsh punishments and the death penalty more than men. They favor government spending on welfare and are less war-prone. These leanings have resulted in more women voting with the Democratic Party than the Republican Party. According to 538, in 2018, if only women voted in the congressional midterm elections, they would have carried the House of Representatives 275 votes to 160 votes. And in the 2020 presidential election, if women voted as opposed to men, Democrats would win 461 to 71. Interesting, in the 2016 presidential election, 56% of married women chose Donald Trump compared with 42% for Hillary Clinton. Unmarried female voters, by contrast, chose Hillary Clinton 62% to 35%. Another way political scientists can break down data is by examining the voter's race. Minorities are increasing as a percentage of the U.S. population, and along with that increase in numbers comes an increase in political clout. However, with the exception of the 2012 presidential election, in which African American voters outnumbered white voters for the first time, turnout among minorities has stalled or declined. Latinos and Asian Americans, however, still vote at a lower rate than whites. Just under 50% of eligible voters in these communities cast ballots, for reasons researchers still debate. Latinos and Hispanics are the fastest growing minority in the United States, now numbering well over 43 million. Typically sides with Democrats on urban, minority, and labor issues, although Cuban Americans have a history of favoring Republican policies. So the conflict over immigration has created a rift between Hispanic voters and the conservative lawmakers. Another way that political scientists can break down voter data is based off of your religious affiliations. Religions tend to share certain beliefs among their members and often tend to vote as blocks. White, born-again, evangelical Christians have become the second largest religious group in the United States. They tend to hold strong conservative beliefs and have become ardent supporters of the Republican Party. In the 2016 presidential election and again in 2020, 80% remain loyal to the Republican Party. Another key demographic voter is the Jewish vote, and Jews vote in large numbers, mainly with the Democrats. Jewish voters comprise a small fraction of the electorate, only 2%. From 1952 until 1968, Jewish support for Democratic candidates ran 20 to 30% higher for that of the general population. And according to exit polls, 70% of Jewish voters favored Joe Biden over Donald Trump in the 2020 presidential election. Today, Catholics make up almost as large of a group as evangelicals. Catholic voters have historically voted with the Democratic Party, but today they cast votes for both parties because they constitute such a large swath of the electorate. During the 2020 presidential election, we saw a racial divide among Catholics. 57% of white Catholics voted for President Trump, as opposed to 68% of Hispanic Catholics who voted for Joe Biden. Today, the Catholic vote seems to lean Democratic nationwide, but is no longer a monolith. It straddles the ideological spectrum. Another way political scientists can make predictions about how you're going to vote and predict your political behavior is whether or not you belong to big business or organized labor. Entrepreneurs, leaders in the business community, CEOs, companies, and shareholders, and much of the upper class tend to embrace a conservative political philosophy and capitalist principles. Small business owners also want less regulation and less interference by the state and federal government in the business world. They want lower taxes and the ability to make more profits. This profile usually results in Republican voting. In contrast, the wage earner, the craftsman, the factory line worker tend to view politics through the lens of the workplace and often in line with their labor union. Since their rise in the late 1800s and early 1900s, labor unions such as the American Federation of Labor have supported government-mandated federal wage laws, child labor laws, safety regulations in the workplace, and fairness on the job. Unions have lost much of their influence today, and membership is down from the prior generation. The decline is explained in part by the laws of 28 states that prohibit union making and union membership mandatory in places of business that have voted to unionize. In the 2016 election, estimates show that Democratic presidential candidates still carried the union vote by perhaps 16 percentage points. Putting all the pieces together, we'll look at 4 different models of voting. The first model of voting is what is called rational choice voting. This takes place when a voter has examined an issue on a candidate and evaluated their campaign promises, platform points, and has conscientiously decided to vote for what is best for the country. At times, these voters will sacrifice their own personal agenda and ask, what is best for America? The next type of voter we have is a retrospective voter, and this is someone who examines a candidate's track records. If they're running for local office, they'll see if they've ever held office before. At a national level, for example, if Republicans have been in control of the White House and the Congress and the economy's not doing well, chances are that voter's going to opt for the Democratic choice. The next type of voter is the prospective voter, and this is a citizen who anticipates the future. They don't necessarily look at the candidate's record, but they look at what the candidate is proposing. A great example is how many young voters felt looking at Bernie Sanders' educational platforms. Students weren't concerned necessarily of Bernie Sanders' past voting record, but they were concerned with what he was going to do. Finally, we have the party line voter. This is the citizen who is affiliated with a political party or ideology, and they're going to vote for that party and that party only. Regardless of what a candidate has done, the voter will remain loyal to the political party. In 2016, for example, exit polls indicate that 89% of Democrats voted for Hillary Clinton, while 90% of Republicans voted for Donald Trump. So there you have it, young scholars. There's your brief overview of voting and voting behavior. I look forward to talking more about this in class with you, but in the meantime, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always email me or post them on Google Classroom.